Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 20th of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby, and joining me on today's show is Robert. We sure miss Jared around here. All right. Good morning, Robert. Let's go ahead and jump into the domestic sitrep. I'll let you take it away.
Good morning, Mike. So yesterday, Senators John Kennedy and Tim Scott and 10 other GOP senators introduced the Protect Our Bases Act. And this would strengthen the Council on Foreign Investment in the U.S. review process for foreign land purchases. Kennedy said this bill, it would require federal agencies to annually update lists of sensitive sites, including military intelligence and national laboratory sites, as he said, to help prevent the Chinese government's efforts to infiltrate and surveil all parts of the U.S. national security apparatus. And then, in a report from the trustees of the Board of Trustees of Social Security and Medicare earlier this week, they said that payments to Social Security recipients would have to take an automatic 23% cut by 2034 if the Trump administration and the U.S. government cannot close the gap between contributions and benefits. And the Medicare Board of Trustees said that funds that cover senior citizen hospital costs could be completely depleted by 2033 and would trigger an automatic 11% cut in payments to hospitals and other medical facilities. And then the Department of Energy announced yesterday a new program, and they said this is aimed at expediting the development of new advanced nuclear reactor designs, and they want this to take place outside of U.S. national laboratories. They said they'd consider designs that they expect would have a reasonable chance of being operational by July next year, and they expect to approve at least 3 of these new advanced nuclear reactors. And then finally, the Department of Justice announced the convictions and sentencing yesterday of 7 members of Partido Revolucionario Mexicano, which is a major prison gang in Texas. I think according to the Texas Department of Public Safety's gang assessment, they consider them a tier 2 gang, and they do operate on both sides of the border. And their Western District of Texas U.S. Attorney Justin Simmons said that their activities actually extend way beyond the bounds of narcotics distribution, which is what they were sentenced for, and that there are 9 other members that are currently being prosecuted.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and jump into the global sitrep. Starting here with the UN, they say it has lost track of Iranian uranium. Say that 5 times fast. How serious is this, Robert?
So the International Atomic Energy Agency chief that oversees the Iranian or uranium, basically their monitoring, said that it's now unclear where Iran's 902 pounds of enriched uranium is located, because they said they were warned by the Iranian government that if Israel attempted to strike this site, this is Isfahan, that they could decide to move this uranium, and apparently they have stopped reporting or allowing access to IAEA's monitors. And according to the IAEA, this 902 pounds of enriched uranium is enough to produce 10 nuclear warheads.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're getting into maybe some of the worst case scenarios here, which has always been you strike a nuclear facility or you threaten the Iranian leadership, and you don't get a nuclear weapon, you get a radiological weapon, and maybe lots of them, because you just have this radiological material that could be used as a dirty bomb. And has there been any movement on how well, first of all, it's the UN, but has there been any talk about how they're going to enforce some of these IAEA regulations on tracking Iranian uranium?
I haven't seen anything on that. I think they're going to have trouble considering the ongoing conflict. I'm sure the IAEA scientists aren't going to want to be in the middle of an exchange of missiles and bombs and put themselves in danger.
Sure, of course. All right. Well, we are going to jump into this discussion on Iran a little bit deeper here in just a moment. For now, we're going to move on to the rest of our sitrep items. And that is we're awaiting the beginning of this NATO summit. Happens in June every year. And it sure seemed like the crowning achievement of this NATO summit was going to be NATO countries agreeing to increasing their defense spending to 5% of their GDP. We've been talking about that for several weeks now. And Spain is saying not so fast. In fact, Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez said that the goal is, quote, not only unreasonable, but also counterproductive. There's also obviously some of these countries are struggling to achieve 2% of GDP spending. I'm not sure how they're going to achieve 5%. So it seems to me like some countries are going to achieve 5%. Some countries may achieve 2%, and that's probably the best we're going to see out of NATO. At any rate, moving on, the Russian economy is, quote, or at least maybe on the brink of recession. This is according to the Russian economic minister. He warned at a financial conference this week. He said, quote, or the Russian economy is cooling. And he said, quote, that judging by the way businesses currently feel and the indicators, we are already, it seems to me, on the brink of going into a recession, end quote. Russia's finance minister did mention that the economy was cooling, but was more optimistic about avoiding a recession. And with that, let's go ahead and jump on into this weekend's protests. We have 346 scheduled across starting today through the weekend. Above baseline, not quite as busy as last weekend. And I just also want to mention, a lot of these protests we have noticed, and I've seen firsthand feedback that a lot of these protests, yes, the numbers are large, 346 protests, but a lot of these don't last for very long. Like maybe a couple hours at max, and you go out there and there's 5, 10, 15, 20 people, and it's over before they say it's going to be over. So I think this is part of a broader effort to make it seem like these protests are larger than they actually are. We're not nearing 2017 levels of protests. And so I think this is realistically, Robert, I know it's not your primary job, but realistically, what was the impact of last weekend's No Kings protests? Or they said they got 5 million people. I don't believe that for a second, but they said they got 5 million people mobilized, which maybe they did. It's definitely in the millions. I do believe they got 3 million back in April. So I think 3 million is probably a good baseline expectation. Maybe they got 5 million. I doubt it. However, here we are a week after. What did they achieve? Absolutely. It's some headlines. That's it.
Yeah, I don't really think anything. I think actually we could see something similar to the pro-Palestine protests that started in late 2023 and went on into 2024, where nothing happens, after there's no real consequences of these protests. And, some portion of these protesters could become demoralized, and another, much smaller portion of these protesters could start turning to more radical politics, looking at DSA, PSL, and local candidates to try to get more left-wing local people in office, and maybe some even smaller proportion start looking at, especially the people like the far left people that are involved and have been conducting direct actions. Maybe they look to ramp those up because they don't see protests as really having any kind of success.
That has been my baseline expectation since last year. Smaller, but the thing is, these people are eventually, Robert, you're right. These people are eventually going to realize that these protests are politically insignificant. They do not move the needle. They're not going to stop ICE operations. They're not going to make the Trump administration change their mind. And all they're really intending to do, if you go back to January of this year, to all those strategy calls that we sat through, Indivisible and 5051 and those other groups said, we have two main goals here. Number one is to push Democrat politicians to take a harder line against the Trump administration. I think that's probably the only development of significance that we've seen from these protests, because we have seen Democrats go out and getting arrested and engaging in forms of direct action. Civil disobedience is next, selective resistance. And then the other thing is to convince Republicans to break with the Trump administration. And so I'm not sure that they've had a large impact on that either. So, all right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on here to the Trump administration is saying that President Trump is going to make a decision on whether to strike Iran within 2 weeks. Robert, just at the outset, that seems like an odd timeline, because I think everyone was pretty much expecting these strikes to happen much sooner. And now maybe it's 2 weeks. I've seen people say, well, this is just classic Trump. It's misdirection. It's disinformation. They say we're going to wait 2 weeks to strike, and then boom, Friday afternoon, the market closes, and then we're going to wake up to Saturday morning to strikes on Iran. I don't know. At any rate, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt mentioned a quote substantial chance of negotiations with Iran, and said that President Trump would decide on strikes within 2 weeks. As of this morning, Iranian officials are saying that they want to negotiate with the European Union because continued Israeli strikes have dissuaded them from negotiating with the United States. Meanwhile, Israeli Defense Force spokesman Brigadier General Efi Defrin said that Israel will continue escalating its air campaign against additional targets in Iran. He says, quote, "We are ready for a prolonged operation until the threat is eliminated." Also, Citigroup mentioned that they expect the price of Brent oil could rise to nearly $90 a barrel if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. The analysts write, quote, "But we think that duration should be short, as all efforts would focus on a reopening, so that it should not be a multi-month closure." I would also note that 20% of all global oil supplies transit the Strait of Hormuz. I think China gets about 50% of its oil that originates from 50% of Chinese oil, I believe, transits the Strait of Hormuz. So that would be a very difficult development for China as well. I tell you, Robert, my bottom line since this thing has started is preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon is kind of just like a delaying tactic. And I think Israel is getting pretty tired of mowing the grass. They showed that with Gaza. And they used to have this strategy, mowing the grass. So some terrorist group would shoot missiles, or there'd be a terror attack or whatever, some border skirmish. And then the Israelis would go in there and they would mow the grass. And the problem is the grass keeps growing back. I think they're tired of this. I think Gaza showed that. I think the Israelis obviously want heads on pikes, metaphorically, in Iran. We continually hear from the Israelis. I mean, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday said that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei should or could be assassinated. He said no one is immune from being taken out. Also, the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said that Khamenei should not be allowed to continue to exist for at least allegedly shooting a missile at a hospital. So, Robert, we were talking before the show here. What do you make of this? Is this the art of the deal, or are we going to wake up Saturday morning to Iranian strikes on the Fordow nuclear facility, or do you think Trump's really holding out for negotiations?
Well, I think the idea that he's just deflecting in order to conduct a strike after the markets close Friday is plausible. But I think right now what's been going on since the 20th of January is a struggle between two different factions within the Trump administration. One faction that does want to basically bomb Iran, stop them from getting a nuclear device, and risk getting involved in a wider conflict. And another faction that's led by like Elbridge Colby, who is really focused on this pivot to China. You can see signs of the struggle happening, like PXS long-term advisors getting kicked out of the Department of Defense over claims that they were leaking documents to the media. But I think Trump is, if I were to have to bet, I would lean towards Trump is actually genuinely wants Iran to come to the table and get some kind of deal so the U.S. does not get bogged down in a Middle East conflict again while trying to conduct this pivot to Asia, because all the other moves being made, especially by the Department of Defense, points to an administration focus on China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I would also say you have to consider what Trump wants his legacy to be. I would not be surprised to see the U.S. destroy, or at least attempt to destroy, this Fordow nuclear facility. What some of the things we've seen is that President Trump maybe has doubts about whether these bunker busters can do it. I've seen a lot of takes in U.S. media about other defense officials having doubts. Robert, have you seen anything on that?
Well, I did see. There were officials that were saying that he doubted that not that the bombs could work, but that the overall plan to eliminate that Fordow nuclear facility could be successful just from bombing it. And then I think Caroline Levitt also said yesterday that one of Trump's concerns of executing a strike is oil prices and the disruption that is striking Iran and the follow-on effects that could happen, like closing the Strait of Hormuz would have on global oil prices. That seems to be another sticking point for Trump.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and if you're Trump, you have to have your eye on the economy, and even temporary spikes in oil prices could not only would be inflationary, but they could tip the U.S. economy potentially into recession, depending on how high oil prices go and how long that lasts. And really, the big thing too is what it does to inflation. Inflation is a highly psychological phenomenon as well. So if you think prices are going to be higher in the future, you're more likely to buy more in the near term, which is inflationary. When you get lots of people spending money in the near term they otherwise wouldn't be, you get velocity of money. So, all right, thanks for that, Robert. We're going to move. Yeah, we'll leave this here for now. We'll circle back to some other stuff in the questions. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this next item here, which is in Washington State. There's a media outlet in Washington State called The Urbanist. I think it's actually based out of Seattle. And they had this long article about how the growing use of these flock safety cameras, these are automatic license plate readers. They said they threaten Washington's status as a sanctuary state. And again, that is according to Seattle news outlet The Urbanist. According to a recent audit, the Department of Homeland Security and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement used hundreds of searches of this data collected by these automatic license plate readers. And these cameras were located at King County Housing Authority, which is manages the public housing projects there in Seattle. They said that the use of flock safeties, ALPRs, these automatic license plate readers, have spread now to over 80 law enforcement jurisdictions in Washington State. The premise of this whole, I guess the conclusion rather, this whole article is that federal law enforcement and also state and local law enforcement are using these automatic license plate readers to hunt down illegal aliens. And they do this, flock safety's thing is we're going to go out and we're going to take a bunch of pictures of these license plates, and that's going to help law enforcement track stolen vehicles. Okay, so we have this picture. It was coming into this housing project, or it's driving down this street, and it's a stolen vehicle. We know where it is, and now we're going to go recover it. And so there's a lot of insurance. There's a lot of grant money and also a lot of insurance interest because those insurance companies want to get those cars back. And so that is kind of what legitimate's a bad word, but that's how primarily or predominantly these ALPRs are being used. The problem that the Urbanist has is that DHS and ICE are using it to find illegal aliens, and they're saying this threatens Washington's sanctuary status. So I think this is probably another. First of all, I don't see these cameras going anywhere. I think they're going to continue to be used, but it does put the state of Washington and also other states like California and Oregon probably in a little more difficult situation because they do have a legitimate law enforcement purpose. And I'm not even going to weigh in the civil liberties and domestic surveillance argument here. I'm just pointing this out. This is predominantly how they're used. However, if you are federal law enforcement, you probably want a lot more access to information like this to help hunt down illegal aliens. And then we'll move on here. Speaking of surveillance, Robert, let's go ahead and talk about FBI surveillance of possible Hezbollah sleeper cells. This is something that Kash Patel came out and said was happening yesterday. So what's going on?
So some U.S. officials, they said the FBI has increased efforts to monitor possible Hezbollah sleeper cells in the United States. And this started earlier this month when Israel began that Operation Rising Lion, where they started doing these Iran strikes. I think, my first question was, is this possible? Yes. And that's because we know Hezbollah and the IRGC, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have conducted operations inside of the U.S. already. And I did find a research report from the George Washington University and West Point, their counterterrorism centers, And when they looked through arrest records up to June 2022, they did find that there are at least, from their definition, 6 known operational Hezbollah networks across 11 states. And they found that there were 4 major hubs: Michigan, which by far had the most individuals that were identified as Hezbollah members, California, New York, and North Carolina. And I think, is it plausible? My second question was, is it plausible that Iran could activate these sleeper cells? And I think it is. But I think the key assumption here is that the first key assumption is the United States joins Israel in this conflict, because I think if the Khamenei government expects an imminent decapitation strike from Israel or U.S. forces conducting these strikes, I think it's plausible that they could activate these Hezbollah cells inside of the United States. However, I think if the Trump administration declines to join Israel in these strikes, the Khamenei government, I think, would likely not see it in Iran's interest to provoke a U.S. response, because some type of terrorism activity or action inside the United States would provide a justification for the Trump administration to start conducting strikes against Iran. And I think he would probably go beyond even a justification. I don't think the Trump administration would be able to ignore that and would be basically politically required to start conducting strikes against Iran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I don't understand why Iran would order or conduct terror attacks inside the United States. I do think it's not outside of the realm of possibility that we see some form of sabotage, something. You go back and you read Unrestricted Warfare by these 2 Chinese PLA colonels. It was published back in the 1990s, and they talk about weaponizing things that Americans don't consider to be weapons. And so they talk about using pandemics, causing earthquakes, causing stock market crashes, all these things that we think are naturally occurring phenomena, using them as weapons of war. This is their unrestricted warfare doctrine. I don't see how it would be outside the realm of possibility for Iran to, or these sleeper cells or whatever they are, to conduct acts of sabotage where there is plausible deniability. They're obviously doing this on behalf of the Iranian government. There's just no direct connection there. And a lot of times, these explosions, we just talked about that big explosion in a fire at, what was it, that natural gas plant?
Yeah, the Galveston, I forget which company. I think it was Mobil.
Marathon or something.
Yeah, Marathon Petroleum.
Yeah. I just drove through there. You drive from Baytown almost into Houston, and it's miles. It's just miles and miles and miles of natural gas terminals and whatever those things are out there. You can see them from the interstate. They're extremely accessible. They're extremely vulnerable. I couldn't see why something like that couldn't happen, and it would effectively be terrorism, but it would just be plausibly deniable for the Iranian government. And if someone was caught, then it's a case of domestic terrorism, foreign inspired or something.
Well, I think we've recently covered the last couple of months, these Chinese scientists flying into the U.S. and smuggling in bioagents that are effectively the really only useful for agroterrorism. I think that's another angle that people don't consider, is that is the U.S. food supply chains are significantly vulnerable to something like that. And you can use naturally occurring bioagents, things that like sicknesses that, for example, livestock, they become infected with just naturally, like avian flu, hoof and mouth disease. And these are things that could be weaponized. And I think that this has been something being considered when I was at Texas A&M in 2017 and 2018. This was something that the agro veterinary side of professors I'd done some coursework with were concerned about even back then, is that someone who wanted to, for example, cripple U.S. livestock could just go up to these ranches and with a bioagent like hoof and mouth disease and cause major damage to U.S. food supply chains. And I think that's another area where if these Hezbollah cells were activated, they could absolutely, instead of conducting, what people would normally consider like traditional terrorism, could then start attacking U.S. food supply chains, critical infrastructure, like we saw with the Transformer attacks a couple of years ago. You could take that form instead of a larger, spectacular terrorist attack on a population center.
Mhm. Yeah, given what we've seen in that Ukrainian strike in Russia and then the Israeli strikes within Iran, it would not take an incredibly it would not take a it would not be outside the realm of possibility that we see some drone swarm attack. Every time I drive through on I-10, drive into Houston from the east side, there's just so much oil and gas infrastructure sitting out there, and it's you look at your little Carver matrix and you do the math and you say, yeah, could be a prime target. Not only that, but once those things get on fire, they're extremely difficult to put out, and the risk that fire grows to other areas is also quite large. And then you have, then you just have a lot of chemical problems as well. But at any rate, Robert, we'll move on, but I'll give you the last word here.
Well, I think if we're talking about fires that can't be put out, the proliferation of solar plants in the United States is possibly another vector for that kind of sabotage, because they have these large storage batteries so that they can continue, quote unquote, generating power when the wind isn't blowing or the sun's not out. And those lithium batteries cannot be put out. They basically, everything I've seen since over the last couple of years, anytime something like that, like a large lithium battery catches on fire, basically the authorities just kind of stand around and wait for it to burn out, because they don't have the ability to put them out. And they also cause like major toxic emissions. So now you have, depending on where that solar facility is, it's basically two strikes in one, because now you're potentially harming any population centers nearby, and then you're also taking down power infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Did you see that video there's a video of some guy in Iran taking a video of something on fire, and there's orange smoke, and this guy's driving towards the orange smoke. Don't drive towards the orange smoke. All right. Don't drive towards any smoke at all. All right. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on here to talk about this unofficial Western response to a Chinese blockade. This is actually Jared's item, and I'm going to try to talk my way through it here. So apparently there is an unofficial war game. Robert, I'll bring you on here in just a sec. There's a war game, and the details were published by Taiwanese state media. And this was based on a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, and participants included former Taiwanese and American chief of staff officials. And the author of this particular article was actually a member of the American team. This war game found that America needs to pre-position at least 3 carrier strike groups and a Marine littoral regiment in the region if they want to stop a Chinese blockade. The U.S. Navy's immediate reaction, they said, would be to sink as many Chinese aircraft carriers and amphibious landing ships as possible in order to deter further aggression. And they also said that U.S. submarines would be able to fire at will. Jared notes that these findings were presented as reactions to a blockade, not an invasion. And so Jared says sinking amphibious assault ships at the time would likely mean targeting them in port or as they are leaving port. And my understanding is Taiwan has the means to do that. Meanwhile, the U.S. government expects to establish a secret channel with the Chinese to privately tell them that further aggression will result in an immediate recognition of Taiwan's independence by the United States and all of its allies. This report also confirmed that the U.S. recognizes a coalition force of Australia, Japan, the Philippines, and the United States to provide primary support for Taiwan. Going forward, Taiwan is expected to continue building asymmetric capabilities, also clarify its rules of engagement, better integrate with coalition forces to avoid friendly fire, and better defend its critical infrastructure. Taiwan summarized its core motivation as, quote, "We're in a struggle for independence. We will prevail. We will win." And in terms of why it matters, there's lots of reasons why this matters. Jared notes that the U.S. and Taiwan use these unofficial war games with former officials to avoid Chinese accusations of collaboration. However, these interactions are effectively a proxy for official policy. So to that end, the United States has just publicized that any Chinese attempt to militarily take Taiwan will lead to a mass recognition of Taiwanese independence and an immediate scuttling of China's largest naval vessels. This is a brazen attempt to deter China from pursuing any further goals against Taiwan by telling them a coalition is prepared to go to war to prevent Chinese annexation of Taiwan. And on that note, by the way, we'll bring Robert on since, Robert, you're the grand strategy guy. I noticed, I've just turned on Fox News for a few moments, and one of the colonels or generals, whoever he was on there, was talking about deterrence. And he said, if President Trump decides to strike Iran now and destroy this Fordo nuclear facility, or maybe more, it's open-ended as far as I'm concerned, what Trump might do, then that will reestablish American deterrence. Because if you're China, you're going to look at this and say, well, America is willing to do what it needs to do, well, from its perspective. And so the Chinese maybe will not doubt that President Trump will also act on Taiwan. You see that as the case?
Actually, I disagree with that, because there's a significant difference between Iran and China, and that difference is China already has a nuclear program, and that completely changes what deterrence looks like. So in the Iran example, you can strike. The U.S. basically has impunity if the Trump administration wasn't concerned about getting bogged down in a conflict. They can basically strike Iran with impunity. There's not much Iran conventionally can do, but if the United States were to strike China, there's a lot that China can do conventionally in return. So the Chinese nuclear capability completely changes what deterrence looks like, and I don't think that strikes within Iran by the U.S. would deter China in any way. It's a completely different problem.
Mm. Well, that makes sense to me, but I'll tell you, just reading some of the military blogs, a lot of people are saying the United States has an opportunity to reestablish dominance. Maybe that's an argument in favor, just a naked argument in favor of the U.S. striking Iran. But I think that is a fair point. Especially it seems to me it's pretty easy to beat up Iran because they do have limited means to strike back. And I think that's a great point. Iran is not China. And so China does have the ability to strike back. Maybe that won't be a deterrent at all. Robert, I think that's a fantastic point. Anything you'd like to add here on this Chinese blockade piece?
I think the focus of the pivot to China focus is less about being able to militarily defeat China. I don't think, reading what Elbridge Colby has written, and a lot of these guys that support the pivot to China have written and said, I don't think it's about I don't think it's about militarily defeating China. It's about, one, showing that the United States could prevail in a conflict if it came to that, but two, it's more about containing China within the Indo-Pacific, not just militarily, but diplomatically and politically, and containing that Belt and Road Initiative. That's been a big thing that China has leveraged to get influence, including in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that is the major focus here, grand strategically. And to me, it makes sense because, like I said before, China has the ability to strike back conventionally if we were to try to apply the Iran or Iraq model to China.
Mm-hmm. All right, fair points all around. And with that, let's go ahead and get to our questions for the day. Carl asks, I had heard that some number of Chinese cargo planes landed in Iran. Speculation is taking things out of Iran. Have you heard that, or do you have any thoughts? So, Robert, we did see this over the weekend, earlier this week, and Flight Radar 24/7, which is what a lot of people use. That's the website a lot of people use to track these ADS-B transponders on these aircraft. Flight Radar came out and said these Chinese planes actually did not land in Iran. They continued on to Belgium, I think is where they were headed. I haven't followed that up. Did you see any definitive reasoning on that?
Yeah, so the Atlantic Council, one of their Middle East experts, put out an update on this, and they said somebody in the air freight industry told them that the tracking of that these planes landed in Iran was actually inaccurate. They actually landed on the border in Turkmenistan, but it makes it look like they landed in Iran. So these Chinese planes didn't actually go to Iran.
Okay, and that's pretty definitive.
As far as I've seen, that's what the newest information is, that just the basically the resolution that you can view on some of these sites, like the 24/7 site, make it appear that they've landed in Iran because they're so close to the border. But they did, I guess, continue on from Turkmenistan to Luxembourg.
Okay. All right. Are these video clips of lasers knocking out missiles in upper atmosphere over Israel, are they real or AI generated? I assume high-powered lasers wouldn't be visible light, or is this a new functional capability? I actually don't know, but there's Iron Dome, and then there's something else a dome that Israel. I remember they were planning on using lasers. I don't know if these are in use or not, Robert.
I don't know if that video, because there's so many of these videos that come out that are like in the case of Ukraine, multiple times they've been basically people taking video clips of video games and purporting them to be real combat footage. But I do know that at least the U.S. government has been looking into using lasers for air defense capability. I think that we covered a hearing, I think, last year where a lawmaker was asking the Department of Defense why we're putting so much money into anti-drone capabilities using missiles that are more expensive than the drones, rather than just putting more money into these, laser air defense systems. So I think the U.S. government at least is doing this, and so I imagine Israel probably, if they don't already have this capability, are at least working on it.
Mm-hmm. All right. If a war in Iran restricts the flow of oil to China, does the war help achieve the Trump administration's focus on the pivot to China, effectively degrading China's ability to wage war? Well, that is something that we have discussed, previously brought up. I think yesterday we're talking about how China has been lobbying Egypt and lobbying some of these other countries to do more to get involved, because they do not want to see regime change in Iran. They don't want to lose their favorite Middle Eastern thorn in the side of the United States. So it seems to me that if there was a regime, I guess maybe this would be the argument for regime change, assuming that it would not take years or longer, assuming Iran would not descend into a Syria civil war-like scenario. But if you could regime change Iran, and now you get this flow of oil that's no longer going to China, then yes, that would have some effect on China's long-term ability to store oil and wage war for a prolonged period of time. Robert?
Yeah, I think if I were to put myself in the Trump administration's shoes, if I think conflict with China, an actual military conflict, is inevitable, then yeah, this is in the interest of that, because it does take away a significant portion of their warfighting capability. You're talking about eliminating, 10 to 16% of their oil. And I think Jared said something yesterday about, well, that eliminates basically their strategic reserve if you eliminate this access to Iranian oil. Mm-hmm. However, that does come with a major risk. One, like you said, if you decapitate the Iranian leadership, you're creating a power vacuum, and now you have the potential to get dragged into nation building again, because it's not, I don't think, in either the United States or Israel's interest to have effectively a civil war going on in Iran, where you're going to have a power struggle, and the people who could win that might be more hostile.
Yeah, I really dislike I actually have no problem personally with taking out Iran, or preventing Iran from being able to build a nuclear weapon. My problem is with the assumption that this could be done cleanly and quickly, and the assumption that Iran will not turn into another Syria, except with radiological elements floating around the country, which this is a worst case scenario. Yesterday I talked about the Gulf cooperation countries standing up their regional emergency operations center and talking about potential chemical, radiological emergencies or attacks. The Saudis are incredibly nervous about what could happen here. And so I think it's right to pump the brakes and to assess the situation, and for the Trump administration to take their time, and whatever they choose to do, just be sure that we're not going to cause another quagmire. I think my personal opinion is I think the Israelis are probably pretty okay with turning Iran into another Syria situation, that would not be good for the United States, the pivot to Asia.
Yeah, I think that, so the
Robert,
example I've seen, so I think maybe I talked about it too much, but this Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz interview. And Tucker Carlson asked him, can you name successful nation building attempts in the last 100 years from the U.S.? And I think a lot of people have been saying, well, obviously Germany and Japan, but World War II is not known as a war where the United States conducted limited airstrikes and then went home immediately. The occupation of Germany and Japan spanned decades, especially Germany. And that basically means that the successful nation building attempt would require, per their examples, the United States to be in Iran for at least years, if not decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to this Taiwan war games, this says we need 3 aircraft carriers in the region. We'll call it South China Sea greater region. And we've got 3 of them sailing towards the Middle East right now. So this just seems like a massive pivot back to the Middle East when we should really be pivoting towards China. But listen, I also get the argument that if the Trump administration does choose to pursue something like I won't say decapitation strikes, but that's exactly what Israel wants. But I think there is a case to be made that and I know a lot of people have PTSD from this, but if you can remake the Middle East, the corpse of Donald Rumsfeld entering the White House, if you can remake Iran and regime change Iran and put quote unquote the good guys in charge, then you remove one of the legs of this stool, one of the 4 legs of this stool. They call it the axis of resistance or whatever. China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. From a grand strategic level, that is their argument, I guess.
Well, they're right that Iran is important, geostrategically, grand strategically, and that's because that's how we used them during the Cold War when the Shah was in power before the '79 revolution. They were a major U.S. ally, especially against the Soviet Union. They're placed strategically. They have access to strategic resources. Obviously, that's why China is their ally and why a blow to Iran, especially their ability to put out oil, is a major blow to China. And yeah, in the best case scenario, if we could depose or assist local forces in deposing the current government and putting somebody more amenable to the U.S. in charge, that would be ideal. I think that is the best case scenario and requires a lot of key assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And probably a long-term commitment as well that we probably just don't want to make. All right, we're going to get through the rest of these questions. What is the likely outcome if the U.S. does give Iran that ultimatum? Well, the Iranians say that they may be open to negotiating limits on uranium enrichment. And I just see this as a delaying tactic. As long as the hardliners are in charge in Iran, they understand Middle Eastern history, which is that when you get a nuke, no one tries to regime change you because they're afraid you're going to use that nuke. So I just don't see any reason why they would not continue to try to build a nuclear weapon, frankly. Speaking of SPRs, how's ours doing? Any refilling yet? Robert, have you seen our strategic petroleum reserve?
I haven't seen anything since the last time we reported on it a couple of months ago. I haven't seen anything from Energy Secretary Chris Wright on if they are, have made any additional purchases or anything.
Mm-hmm. All right, last question. The U.S. is highly dependent on Taiwan semiconductors, on everything from jets to toasters. If the U.S. were to significantly reshore semiconductors, would defense of Taiwan change? Well, I guess that's been the foot race for TSMC and Intel and all these other companies trying to get these foundries up and running here domestically, semiconductor foundries. I think that we are not going to be able to produce the same level of semiconductors, like the 2 and 3 nanometer semiconductors that TSMC is churning out here domestically. Robert, that's my understanding, is that we're not building the same type of advanced semiconductors. Is that correct?
Yeah, as far as I've seen, the TSMC plants in Arizona, or they're trying to get to that level. But I think the last I saw, they're talking that's like a year or two out, and they're still working on being able to build the more advanced ones and also expanding their production.
So I don't think. Oh, now Ben says this is a rhetorical question. Okay, pardon me. All right. Well, everyone, that's going to do it for today's morning briefing. Also, do it for today this week. So we hope you have a great rest of your Friday, a great weekend, and we will be back in your inbox on Monday, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.